To welcome to those who have signed up for this event. We're extremely pleased to have with us one of the foremost experts, I dare say, certainly in Washington and probably beyond Washington, on anything that pertains to public spending, federal public spending, entitlement programs, fiscal issues, and how they're managed or not managed, appropriately in Washington by the powers that be, which is by the Congress and the president, and how all this weighs on the general picture of the American economy and beyond. So Maya MacGuineas is with us today, and she is going to discuss with me these matters and hopefully shed some light on matters that are extremely important, but unfortunately quite complicated. And many of us simply don't have the time, the patience to focus on these complexities. And when we start talking about not billions, but trillions of dollars in spending, in debt, and whatever, we kind of roll our eyes and say, what's a trillion? How do you even conceive 1,000 billion? What is that? And what difference does it make? What difference does it make in my own personal life? And so on and so forth. And this is why, to some extent, these matters continue to, follow their own course. And unfortunately, the degree of bipartisan support that would be needed to tackle head on the problem of systemic overspending is just not being addressed, at least not to the extent that, that would make a real difference. So with that, I would like to get started and thank you, Maya, for being with us. I wanted to start with this basic question, which is sort of a new theory, which seems to have emerged and gained altitude and currency in the last several months. We go back, in fact, to the presidential campaign, in which some economists, who supported, in support, so to speak, of expanded public spending on the part of Washington, when others would say, hey, but wait a minute, that's too much money. We don't have it. We have to borrow and go deeper into debt to fund all these worthy initiatives, maybe in principle. And they say, it doesn't really matter. What do you say to that?
Well, first, I say thank you for having me. Nice to be with you today. I'm always glad to have a good discussion about fiscal policy and the national debt. Yeah, there has always been the tendency of people, politicians in particular, and advocates who want to see certain policies that they favor implemented to make the case that you don't need to pay for things, that there's no real constraint on the budget. And there's an obvious reason for this, which is politically, it's much more difficult to accomplish something if you actually have to go through the hard work of paying for it, rather than if you are able to make the case that it's free. We've seen this around tax cuts, around the large tax cuts we had in 2017, where there were a number of people making the case that those tax cuts had no cost associated with them. We are starting to see that around infrastructure spending now, where people are saying, don't worry, infrastructure will pay for itself. And a lot of this is anchored in kind of theories crafted to justify that outcome. Again, with tax cuts, there was supply side economics. The tax cuts will grow the economy so much they'll pay for themselves. The truth is they will not. And the newest theory says basically because we print in our own currency, it means we're not going to default. That's basically just stating an obvious fact. But what doesn't go with that is the fact that it's totally safe then to borrow unlimited. If you're borrowing, even in your own currency where you won't default, you're having huge effects in the global economy and your own domestic economy. And in this case, there's a great chance that if you borrow too much, you will experience inflation. This is obviously something that we're starting to think about more right now as we're seeing the first signs of inflation as we're coming out of the huge crisis of COVID and the big recession around that. But part of that inflation is driven by the fact that we spent so much appropriately and borrowed so much appropriately to fight the pandemic. But now we have too much money in the pipeline. The last fiscal bill was bigger than it needed to be for economic purposes. And that's going to push up inflation, along with other issues of having the end of pent-up demand as the economy opens back up. So let's not confuse two things. There's this new kind of nonsensical argument that you can borrow as much as you want just because your currency is that you're borrowing in your currency. That is dangerous. That can create inflation. And if and when you have inflation, if you don't have the Fed targeting inflation in the proper way and you've moved that responsibility over to lawmakers, which is what this recommends, you're going to have a very hard time pushing it, fighting it, getting control of it. But there are lots of times to borrow. And those times are primarily when you have huge economic or natural disaster types of emergencies. So we've just come out of a time where it was perfectly appropriate that we were borrowing. That kind of normal Keynesian economics of borrow when times are bad and then save more when times are good is in no way the same as don't worry, there are no budget constraints. So I think some people try to conflate them out of convenience, but we would be fooled into thinking that's a safe way to approach our economy, which would have probably some very dangerous after effects once we hit that period of higher inflation.
But also, segue to that, you mentioned the role of the Fed. It looks like the Fed has been transformed into a team of magicians or wizards who can keep interest rates at zero forever because they say so, because they have magic policies whereby they can do this. So they can repress interest rates, buy the US debt indefinitely in quantities which are, how can I say, infinite potentially, and that this will be fine. Again, this is in support to the theory that if you borrow in your own currency, you're good. So what I see, please correct me if I'm wrong, that notion plus this sort of almost medicinal role of the Fed that can keep interest rates at zero, real interest rates at zero indefinitely, that will do it. And people will point to a country, say like Japan, say, look at Japan. They have an enormous national debt, is mostly domestically financed, and Japan is doing fine. What do you say to that?
Okay, those are very long questions.
So sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, well, first off, the case of Japan. Japan has a debt of 240% of GDP. The reason that it has not reached more of a crisis situation is because they have so much domestic savings. They are able to borrow money from domestic savers in Japan. That's how they finance it. That means when you're repaying those interest payments, they're not leaving the economy, and at least they're not depressing the standard of living. In the US, we borrow about 40% from abroad. That means those interest payments do leave our economy. Our standard of living, as a result, grows much slower than it otherwise would. You don't want that to happen. And you also don't want what Japan has already, which is not the kinds of growth levels one would be aspiring towards. And they've been stuck in that model for quite some time. So it's not a crisis, because fiscal policy doesn't always create a crisis that you can see in the immediate moment, but it's basically a chipping away at the foundation of your economy and your growth. And so that's probably why I think the Japan case, which people love to invoke as, look, we can borrow, right now our debt to GDP is 100+% of GDP. People say you can get up to where Japan is. You wouldn't want to. That's not the economic recipe for growth that you want to have in any country. And one of the reasons it's so important to have economic growth is that, of course, finances whatever agenda people want. Our organization is bipartisan and incredibly focused on that mission, meaning it doesn't matter whether you want bigger government or smaller government. The case, whatever case you have, whatever argument you have for the vision of government is compromised by debt payments that are crowding out other areas of your budget. And so that kind of risk is not something that you want to build into your budget.
Back to the composition of American spending, maybe you can shed some light, as I indicated a moment ago, on the structural issues which precede any recession, precede COVID, precede any extraordinary intervention that was justified by the threat of the pandemic and what have you. Please tell us in very simple terms as you can, where does the money go? Where did it go before, and will still go most of the money, leaving aside the Biden spending programs that we'll get to in a moment? Where does Uncle Sam spend the taxpayers' money, and also the reason for the sort of systemic shortfalls that we have been experiencing now for decades?
Sure.
And
Well, I
one,
encourage people to go look. We actually have a number of interactive tools which help people learn more about the budget pie, the allocation of resources, how they're divided between the generations, between different kinds of programs. So I encourage people to go and play around with them. They're actually quite fun. Not that a budget tool sounds like it would be, but it is. And you can find them on our website, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, or a special suite of tools we have at Budgeting for the Future. So when you look at our federal budget, what people think is where we spend money is actually quite different than where most of the money goes. People will always think, like you said, there's defense, there's international aid. People think waste, fraud, and abuse is like a line item in the budget. It's not. But the biggest bulk of our spending goes on retirement programs and healthcare programs. Probably half of our budget is focused on those programs. Most of them are called mandatory. Mandatory programs are those that do not go through the annual discretionary budgeting process, but instead they're basically an automatic pilot, meaning if somebody qualifies for the program, they get those benefits. Those mandatory programs encompass our retirement and healthcare programs. They also have things like agriculture subsidies, veterans, pensions, a lot of different programs that are basically if then. If you are X years old and have paid into the system for a certain amount of time, or if you are this kind of a worker, or if you work for the government this long, then you'll get these benefits. Those programs problematically have growth that is much faster than the economy, and they also don't have enough oversight. Lawmakers don't spend nearly enough time actually looking at those programs, whether they're solvent, whether they're sustainable. In fact, our four major trust funds, Social Security Retirement, Social Security Disability, Medicare Part A, and our Highway Trust Fund, all are assumed to become insolvent, three of them within a decade, the fourth just right outside of that window. And so yet lawmakers kind of march along thinking those programs will work as promised. They won't. They're actually unable to make the spending promises. And that's a really dangerous way to create sort of the oversight of those programs one would expect. Where lawmakers do spend a lot of their time is on the 1/3 of the budget that's discretionary spending. About half of that, 13% of the budget or so, 14% of the budget is defense spending. The other half is domestic discretionary. Those are things that people basically are the things that people think of as the government. Education, the environment, worker retraining, some of our means tested welfare programs, many of those are in that domestic discretionary category. And again, that's only, it's less than a fifth of the budget, really small shares.
Well, that's really important because I think, again, as you say, most people think that the government does this and does that and has all this money to throw around, etc. But if I understand the trends correctly, that share of the budget, the non-defense discretionary spending, has been shrinking, right, over the years, incrementally. And so the government is increasingly about less and less. In other words, if one of the missions of the government would be to help support economic growth and future development and investing in America's future, the tools, the means, the financial means at the disposal of the government to do this as a percentage of total spending are shrinking every year. And I guess we should also add, I think, even though interest rates mercifully are still very low, that the percentage of yearly spending that goes to debt service, correct, increases because the total amount of debt increases. And so interest rates, even if historically low, absorb more of yearly revenue. So basically the United States government, the way I see it, please correct me if I'm wrong, is becoming a check writing machine mostly. And in programs that are on automatic pilot. And the ability to do more of the things that we would like to do, R&D, space exploration, who knows what, supporting the IT industry, education, there's not much left. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, so it's 2/3 of the budget that goes to those basically check writing programs, and then some that aren't mandatory also fall in that category. Certainly, I agree with your point, which is we are underinvesting in this country and over consuming in terms of the federal budget. The federal budget does a lot more in terms of transfer payments, oftentimes to people who don't need them, rather than the kinds of public investments, I would say human capital is the greatest need we have. Infrastructure, if done right, is another one way at the top of the list. Basic R&D for all sorts of things. Those have been being squeezed out over the decades. And so it used to be the reverse, that discretionary portion of the budget where most of your public investment was about 2/3, and now it's down to 1/3. So we have for a long time been building constituencies who like their programs. If you're getting a check for Social Security, you like that program, and you probably think that you're only getting what you paid into it. The actual interesting piece is that so many people, as we're living longer, are getting much more out of Social Security than they paid in because of growing life expectancies. But so there's a big, broad constituency for any spending program that sends checks to people. But there's not as broad a constituency for the kinds of public investment that lead to productivity gains that grow your economy over time. And so that's a problem in companies too, but really particularly in the federal government, where there's not a strong enough constituency on the importance of public investments and those dividends that they pay over the coming years. And as a result, we have been underinvesting. And as another result of that, I think our economy will grow much more slowly going forward than it could have if we had made those investments along the way. But it's not too late to change course. We need to think about what a portfolio of productive public investments would be. We need to figure out what parts of the budget we can stop spending on. And I think we need to make a massive pivot in our budget away from immediate gratification and consumption into looking at the threats and challenges and opportunities of the future and making the appropriate investments to meet them.
Well, I mean, I guess we'll have a chance to get into that. The Senate just passed this interesting, bill to support U.S. R&D and research and all kinds of interesting things. So we'll see what happens when the bill goes into the House. This is kind of, let's call it an anti-China, or let's say, let's build up, I don't know, defenses against China. I know I'm oversimplifying this, but there's a lot of that, and it's quite bipartisan. We'll see what happens to this bill in the House, and we'll have a chance to discuss it as we move along, examining the spending programs of the Biden administration. But I also, to underscore the point that you just made, I also wanted to point out, if I'm correct, that right before COVID, right at the beginning of 2020, when things, at least on the surface, were looking pretty good, right? The Trump administration was, as a steward of the economy, leaving aside the fact that the president really doesn't have all this great, ability to influence the economy. But let's say that under the stewardship of the Trump administration, at the beginning of 2020, the economy was growing, not at incredible pace, but was over 2%. Unemployment was at historic lows. And yet the federal budget deficit was $1 trillion. $1 trillion in peacetime, in a full employment economy. Nobody said anything. I don't recall, maybe, these debates in a much more granular fashion than most of us, but I mean, do you recall anybody saying, oh my, what's going on here? Have we lost our minds? Why are we overspending this much with an economy that's at full throttle? Usually, as you indicated, overspending is recommended to face a crisis. There was no crisis before COVID, I hasten to say. What do you say to that? Was that an indication of the new normal, $1 trillion deficit in a full employment economy?
So I sure recall some people saying some things, and that was our organization. We were really quite stunned that in the 3 years going up to the COVID emergency, our Congress passed and our president at the time, President Trump, signed into law 4.7, almost $5 trillion of new borrowing on top of all the borrowing structurally built into the budget they had inherited, which they did nothing to improve, and brought us up to near record levels of national debt. So on one hand, of course, the economy was doing well. We had put in a massive sugar high, something we may be about to do again. We didn't get hit by inflation then. We might this time, though it may well be temporary and not longer lasting. But sure, if you flood the economy with huge tax cuts, which we did, followed by huge spending increases. We had $2 trillion bills of spending increases right after those tax cuts. And then another bipartisan $500 billion tax cut. So yeah, the economy is going to do really well. The problem is, where is that going to land? So COVID aside, recession aside, you cannot borrow your way to prosperity. You cannot borrow in a way that's going to heat up your economy in a sustained way, because you are building built-in dependence on that borrowing. We had a built-in dependence on interest rates. Your economy will overheat if you're exceeding the capacity in the economy. And it means that you're basically robbing the future's budget flexibility and ability to make their own investments for the immediate gratification of the moment. So that's what we were doing then. And we were incredibly vocal about how it was so dangerous to leave ourselves as indebted as we were leaving ourselves. We are very lucky as a nation because we have this incredible advantage of having the currency that's a safe haven, having demand for our US treasuries, even when the economy turns down. That won't last forever. There are many countries and regions that are trying to rival the US, the dominance of the dollar, and they will succeed sooner or later to some extent. That will weaken our position. We will not be able to borrow so much and live beyond our means. And that painful moment of sort of when the music stops, seeing who sits where, is going to cast a real challenge on younger workers today. Not even probably that young, is probably not that far off that things get more difficult if we don't change the borrowing trajectory, and certainly future generations. So it is the opposite of the American dream or American promise, which is to try to leave an economy that is stronger than the one you inherited. It's what we've always done in the past, but it looks like it's what we're on track to fail to do this time around. And that's why I think so many young people have become disillusioned with our economic system and the stewardship of our governance, of what they're providing, which is why you see incredibly low approval ratings, both for capitalism and democracy at the moment. I think it connects right back to the poor stewardship that we've been seeing and the rush for immediate gratification and really in many ways stealing from the future to pay for today.
Let's stop on this issue for a moment. You mentioned before the example of Japan, where the Japanese deficits are funded almost entirely domestically, right? Because as you indicated, right, there's a significant surplus of savings, and the Japanese, as good patriots, buy the bonds, right? Or through the banks or whatever the system is done, the post office system, whatever they have. And so it's kind of self-financed. Whereas here in the US, as you indicated, we have to go abroad to fund significant portions of our deficit. And now you're saying, hey, this may not last forever. Well, do you have any scenarios? Do you have anything in mind that says at some point the big buyers of US bonds, which by the way include countries like China, that we are not exactly on the friendliest of terms right now. They hold huge amounts of US treasuries. But then there's everybody else. There's Japan, of course, and others all over the world, because again, who would doubt the good credit and the trustworthiness of US, something that says Treasury of the United States on it? The US will never default. Okay. Give us a sense, or a possibility at least, at what point what can go wrong? In other words, who could be able to change this course? Now we think somehow we are almost entitled to have the financing of our debt. What can change? And if countries stop or diminish their purchases of US securities, realistically, where do they park their money? What could be a better place that would give them better, guarantees that ultimately these debt obligations will be honored? How do you see this happen? I know it's complicated, but do you have any scenarios in mind how this could unravel?
So the problem when you're as over indebted as we are, and again, we are about to surpass the highest debt to GDP ratio we've ever had in this country. And that was set right after World War II. We had just fought a world war. We borrowed throughout that time. Our debt to GDP hit 106% of GDP, but very quickly we were able to bring it back down through growth and bringing our budget back under control. We are at that level already, and we are headed much, much higher with the debt growing faster than the economy forever. So when you are that fiscally weak as we are, anything can set it off. We're basically living in a debt bubble. It's not dissimilar to a tech stock bubble, a housing bubble, a tulip bubble, a gold bubble, things where people continue to stay on that course because it looks like everybody else will. But whenever there's a sign of change, things can shift, and it can be fast, and it can be ugly. And so the problem is that if there's an undermining of confidence of the US Treasury market, how quickly that could change, and that could lead interest rates to go up very quickly. We are so dependent on those low interest rates. And as a point you made earlier, our interest payments are quite low considering our massive debt load. They're still high. $300 billion a year is not cheap. It's about the 5th largest program in our federal budget. But if interest rates go up even 1%, 1 percentage point, that is going to increase those interest payments by another $300 billion a year. So any little change that lowers the demand because people get worried that the bubble scenario is going to burst and they want out quickly means we suddenly have massive increases in interest payments. That's just one of the many scenarios. Inflation can change. Our currency, the demand for our currency can change. Of course, countries are going to want to diversify where they are purchasing, where they are parking their savings. Nobody wants to be dependent on the US when we're both fiscally and politically kind of on shaky ground. Politically, we keep changing back and forth, sort of the majority of the country, the policies are shifting. There's obviously much more division than there's been in the past. So the political reassurance we've always had the benefit of doesn't hold as well. Now you also have weaknesses around the world. So we're not alone in that problem. But I think there'll be a strong case for diversifying when it comes to different currencies. But the main point is, if your foundation is weak, almost anything can cause it to crumble. So external shocks, cyber attacks, looking like the shift in the US-China relationship is going away in a different direction from the US more quickly than people anticipated, shifts from technology, another downturn, another pandemic, a national emergency, a terrorist attack. I mean, anything can cause it to happen. Basically, excessive debt is excessive vulnerability. And the US is dangerously vulnerable right now, and we're too strong a country to be choosing this course.
Well, very good point. And again, I would like to bring attention of everybody here to what you just said. A 1% increase in interest rates, another $300 billion in debt service payments. Yeah. That's 1%, you would think, oh, 1% can't be that much. Well, when you borrow such huge numbers, of course, 1% on billions and billions of dollars of outstanding debt can change the calculus very significantly. And again, I welcome what you're saying regarding the fact that we've created sort of a structural vulnerability, which makes us fragile to potential shocks and other things. But again, then ultimately, and we'll come to that in a moment, it's a matter of political judgment. For people who are running for office, especially if you're a congressman and you're running now, that you just got elected and in 2 years you're running for re-election, if you say, well, if this happened and that happened, maybe 10 years from now this may happen and what have you, and therefore it's time to cut our spending and be frugal and whatnot. This person wants to be re-elected, and you don't usually get re-elected on a platform of frugality. But if you're dishing out more stuff, hey, that makes you very popular among your constituents. I guess we can come to that in a moment about the political dilemmas lacking a real new bipartisan consensus. I know this is what your organization is doing, and you've been doing this for a long time. But let's see what's the realm of the possible in the present political environment. But let's circle back for a moment to what you were saying earlier. That is, pre-pandemic, we had already this huge structural imbalances that got worse every year. And that gave us the sugar high of, somewhat inflated growth because, when the government spends so much money, obviously it lubricates the system in a way that is not possible otherwise. that plus the tax cuts, et cetera, et cetera. So then we got to the pandemic and this blowout in spending, which arguably had its own, justification. And that was done on it seems to me, on a bipartisan basis. Everybody said, okay, we got to do something, mostly support employment, or rather income of people who all of a sudden found themselves jobless. And this is millions and millions of Americans who could not work from home, like some of us. And so let's say that was justified. Now let's fast forward to today's core topic, which is Biden spending plans. And there's plenty to talk about, from the gigantic energy spending to, again, more direct transfer payments, help to families with small children, and then infrastructure spending. How, point by point, since there's a huge package here, several packages arguably, how do you view this in the light of what we've been discussing until now, that is, of the already established vulnerability of the United States fiscal house due to decades of overspending? What this president, I suppose with perfectly good intention, is proposing is to double down in a major way and increase spending. And I'm sure you want to, also give us your own sense of the difference between spending and investments, and where is wise to put money and where is not wise. How do you assess this gigantic plans, at least for increased federal outlays?
Okay, so the first point is that what we've been doing recklessly is not overspending, it's over borrowing. I think it's a really important point that to be fiscally responsible and fiscally good, fine steward is not about big government or small government. It's about your willingness to pay for it rather than asking for somebody else to. So that's the problem that I think we have been relying on over borrowing for so many years and decades at this point. The president's budget has a lot of pros and cons as far as I'm concerned. I think his priorities, which are really shifting towards public investment, are ones that I share. That's more personal than institutional, but I think most people would agree with the case that our overconsumption has been squeezing out important public investments for a long time. And so I think it's really welcome to put forth an agenda that says infrastructure, broadly defined in this case, and human investment are things that will be the priorities of the administration. I think the goals make sense. That said, the size of these packages, I believe, are far too large. I don't think one can justify all of the places where that spending is going to go. I believe that will lead to huge misallocation of resources and billions and billions of dollars being wasted. I fear that the political oversight that will be in charge of determining who gets how much will be politically motivated rather than investment motivated. I'd love to see an outside group of experts appointed to determine what the infrastructure needs actually are, rather than a whole lot of members of Congress facing tough elections who really are just interested in showing their constituents that they can bring home big dollars. That's not the way you make smart investments. So I think a disciplining process is really necessary. Back to things I think the president and his administration have done right. They've said they're going to pay for this agenda. And that is not easy in a time where they're riding on the heels of a White House, the previous president, who didn't try to pay for anything, who basically borrowed his way through the entire term. His promise was, I'm going to cut taxes, I'm going to raise defense spending, and I promise not to fix Social Security and Medicare programs. That was a really fiscally reckless approach. And I think there was a lot of pressure on this administration to match that with different direction of recklessness. And so I give them real credit, and it is tough politically to say, we're going to pay for this. There are a lot of members of their own party who disagree with that. But from the point where we are in the economic cycle, it is, and certainly where we are with the debt, it is absolutely the right thing to do. Now, what they don't do is pay for enough of it quickly enough. Their objective is to pay for the spending in about 15 years. And that relies on calling a lot of the spending temporary, even when you have people in the administration saying, it's not going to be temporary. We're going to keep the spending in place when it comes to a lot of programs for children and other things. So You need to talk about where you need to double down. You need to double down on that commitment. You need to pay for it in a reasonable amount of time, which is a decade. Would make sense. You don't have to pay for it every single year, but you need to pay for it over 10 years. Otherwise, we're going to be adding another $1.5 trillion in borrowing on top of the amount we're already slated to borrow, which this White House hasn't tried to fix. None of the borrowing in Social Security and healthcare and structurally built into our budget do they address. So that would lead us to 14 or 15 trillion in borrowing over a decade. That could do tipping point kind of damage. That's a very scary amount of borrowing to contemplate with no reforms. So I think they need to improve how much they actually pay for. And there are a lot of ways to do that. There are more tax increases, the kind the president has said he doesn't want to have tax increases over $400 billion. For over families that are making over $400,000. It's really hard when you talk in billions and trillions just to go back to normal dollars. So normal family of 400,000 wouldn't be affected by tax increases. That's probably a politically sensible pledge. I'm sure his consultants love that idea, but it doesn't make for good tax policy. And it's not realistic about the kind of spending expansion he's talking about. It can't just be the very wealthy where those bills are being footed. There is more you could do there than he's proposed, but not enough to pay for both fixing the debt and the overall investment strategy that he wants. So you can also look at more broad-based taxes, user fees, carbon taxes, other things that would affect people below 400,000 as well. Certainly you can look at getting rid of a lot of the existing tax breaks that are built into our budget. There's $1.8 trillion a year in tax breaks, most of them not particularly effective. We can clean that up. You can do something that this budget doesn't do. You can cut spending in other areas. Like I said, I'm a big believer we need to be investing more, but I also think we need to be consuming less. And that means looking through the budget, figuring out where we can cut programs. And I think there are a lot of places we should look. We should certainly put discretionary spending caps back in so the growth of our budget isn't double digit, which it's looking like it's likely to be otherwise. And we should talk about how to fix some of these big programs so that they're more targeted to people who need them. There's a lot of discussion about universal benefits on everything. If money were free, like some people want to pretend it is, it would be great. We could give everybody everything, but it's not. And so when it comes to trade-offs, in my mind, the most important priorities are big investments that will pay off well for our country, our economy, and our families and our children, and helping people who need it the most more than you're helping people who need it less. So those are my priorities. Everybody's welcome to have different ones, which is why I love these budget tools we have, and people should check them out because you can totally disagree with me. You can think we need huge universal benefits and go look at the costs and figure out how you'd get the numbers to add up, because there's no right or wrong here. There's the exercise of figuring out what makes sense. So, and then if you do these tools, by the way, we will take the results and we will send them not just to Congress, but also to the White House, because we want to use it as an effort to crowdsource what the priorities are. So then back to the Biden budget. I think the sequencing and the timing is wrong. I understand they want to expand spending. I understand those priorities as important ones, but you have to do the hard work of getting our existing budget into shape first. We cannot be on track to borrow $1 to $2 trillion every year indefinitely, and then use a lot of the tax increases that they have identified to pay for new spending before you close that existing gap. And we should think about closing that existing gap. One thing many people may have seen, there's an op-ed today about how much goes in unpaid taxes every year. There's hundreds of billions of dollars that we could collect by better enforcement, better technology, making sure that before we raise taxes, we collect the taxes that were already owed. That's one kind of step that would help close that fiscal gap. Some of these other revenue raisers and spending reductions need to go to stabilizing the debt first before they start paying for new priorities, or we're going to have a very, very hard time fixing the debt.
On this issue of, as you said, making a huge distinction between spending and borrowing to spend with money you don't have. Of course, if we had huge reserves, then we could have the flexibility to spend more without incurring in the jeopardy that you discussed today with us. But let's talk about taxes. It seems to me please, you have the pulse of many people, either former people in Congress or people who are currently in the Congress on both sides of the aisle. What are realistically the chance of passing tax increases in this Congress, given the extremely, as we know, slim majorities that Biden's party, the Democrats, have both in the House and the zero majority in the Senate, which is 50-50 with the vice president as tiebreaker? What are realistically the chances to say, okay, this is not borrowing. We're going to do maybe some of including some of your suggestions, a more fine-tuned spending program with a more realistic revenue-raising program. But realistically, what are the chances that this is actually going to become law, that we can increase revenue by having at least some Republicans agree on a tax increase before the 2022 midterm election?
Well, I doubt you're going to see Republicans supporting a tax increase. It's possible if it's tied to something where it's called user fees and there's enough infrastructure spending. But I doubt we're going to see a bipartisan revenue increase. I think we probably will have some taxes go up. I think that there's the technique of reconciliation where they'll be able to move some of these things with just a majority rather than a supermajority. And so I think you're likely to see some revenue increases, probably less than they're talking about now rather than as much, because the truth is nobody likes to pay taxes, and it's always easier to not pay for something than to actually pay for something. So I fear those taxes will be winnowed back, when what I think is we need actually even more. And I don't like paying taxes more than anybody else does, but if we want to spend this much, we need to pay for it. So, my hope is we'll have those taxes and more, and we'll reduce some of the spending. My prediction is that we'll have fewer of those taxes, and in the end, I don't think we'll increase the spending to beyond what the Biden administration has asked for, because it is a historically massive amount, but they'll probably find some ways to use some of that money to kind of entice people to support the packages, because the job of pushing for fiscal responsibility is so challenging, because what you want to do is get a whole bunch of lawmakers to say, we're going to insist on doing this the right way, where it's fully paid for and it's really well targeted and thought out. But what's much easier is to get a bunch of lawmakers who say, we're going to give you everything we want. Here's your tax cut. Here's your spending increase. The next generation is going to deal with it. And I think that easy route is more likely to win out.
So that's
but it doesn't keep us from trying. I mean, because honestly, I have to say, this issue is too important to ignore. It weakens our country economically, but also in terms of our geopolitical standing. We are becoming massively vulnerable to all the risks on the global stage, because it is going to be so difficult to respond to them while we are borrowing from some of the very same countries we're competing with. And if interest rates are to go up, our economy could really be in trouble very, very abruptly, just at a time when you wouldn't want it to be.
Still within this framework, as we know, a big component of President Biden's spending, or in this case, we could say arguably investment agenda, is energy, right? And here, maybe we get into a complicated terrain, because much of this is based on certain value judgments and in certain opinions that people have or don't have as to how urgent a conversion of the U.S. economy from a carbon-based energy systems to non-carbon, how urgent that is, and also how cost-effective it would be to achieve these changes. The administration says we're going to have millions of new green jobs. We're going to transform the American economy. We'll be the leaders in environmentally, correct, sensitive policies. We're going to decarbonize the American economy. And some people say, wait, this is not going to happen. It's too complicated to do in the framework, in the time frame you're advocating. And so my question to you, and I know this is kind of gets basically into a value judgment, and I don't know what the right answer is. There is a danger that this significant component of Biden's spending, which is really presented as investment in our non-carbon future, that it becomes malinvestment, that it becomes pouring enormous resources into technologies that are not yet, proven to be cost effective on a side-by-side comparison with fossil fuels. And this, I'm not saying advocating fossil fuels. I'm saying we're not there yet. So what do you comment on that? Is that something that it's wise spending, which again, I suppose in their own definition, in the administration definition, would be investment in our non-carbon future? Do you see that as a deserving the level of priority and extent of outlays that the administration is proposing, on the assumption that we are on a climate emergency, that this is an existential threat? That's the assumption, right? Based on that, how do you view all this? Because this is a lot of money.
I do share that concern. I do share the concern that it is a huge threat. And I think that our neglect of the climate situation is similar to our neglect of the debt situation. These are issues that are hard to quantify the costs. They are long-term. There is no immediate action forcing moment, but the longer that we wait to contend with them, whether it's climate or the debt, the more vulnerable, possibly in danger that we are. And so, yes, it's really difficult to give up something today for the hope to avoid a big risk in the future. But that's part of what governing is. It's not just paying for the things that are obvious right now. It's figuring out how you mitigate the risks of the future. And so while I am convinced that much of this spending will be wasted, I do think that the process should be vastly improved with much tighter oversight for energy policy and for infrastructure policy. I think the objective is absolutely critical, and that if we don't make investments today, and they should be as good as possible and they can be improved from where they are, but if we don't prioritize it, I believe the chance that we pay a much, much higher cost in the future is way too high to risk.
Thank you. On this issue that I touched upon earlier, which is not yet law, but probably will be law very soon in some fashion. This bill just passed by the Senate, which supports significant new outlays in R&D and supporting in new technologies, or buttressing the American industrial base in critical technologies. That seems to be more in line of what you're recommending. Is that fair? Or I mean, no, I know that.
I don't think that's an apt description. I am recommending a budget that we shift from consumption to investment wherever possible, but first and foremost, where we pay for it. My goal, our goal, is not to set out the recipe for what the right budget is. There are different preferences. We're a diverse country with diverse preferences, diverse ideologies, diverse view of government. I want us to work through those differences productively and civilly. And so while what I want is, and I'll be clear about it, right? I want to cut a lot of consumption spending, and I want to increase a good deal of investment spending, and I want to pay for it all, except for when there's good reasons to borrow, like in cases of emergency when the economy needs it. But what I want doesn't necessarily matter. The question is, what does the country want? What do the voters want? But what I don't think we should have is a system that lets what the voters want be everything for free to actually be enacted. I think there has to be some constraints that make budgeting actual budgeting. So that's our priority as a fiscally responsible, focused organization. How are you going to make sure that we don't debt finance everything, which is really going to leave the future strength of this country in great question compared to where it could and should be?
Let me try to delve a little, in the time we have remaining, delve a little deeper in the how to say, the process. And I know you've worked, and you're currently involved in so many different manners of addressing all this. I do remember, and I'm sure you do remember extremely well, the Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, the Debt Commission, right? The moment of truth, 2010, if I'm not mistaken. That was one example, it seemed to me, or probably the last one that I can remember, of meaningful bipartisan effort, right? That was a commission that was recommended initially, at least by President Obama. That was bipartisan. And in the end, it even though it didn't take care of everything, but there was a genuine bipartisanship at a very high, significantly high level of government to recommend reforms in the areas that you noted earlier that are essentially untouchable, at least regarding Social Security, medical care. So that came and went, right? These two gentlemen, I think, are patriots who really didn't do this for fun or to gain, easy popularity. They came up with a report. It was approved by a majority of the members of the commission, and then nothing happened. Right? They continued to talk about it, and were on talk shows and whatever. And that was 2010. Now we are in 2021. The spending trends are pretty much what you described. What could be realistically a modality to address these matters, like were done by the Debt Commission, or something maybe different, but functionally that serves similar purposes, that can give us a hope of making progress? And it has to be bipartisan. I don't think it can be done otherwise. Do you have any? I know your organization is working on these things, but ultimately it's about politics, and you've got to have the leaders of the country on both parties agree on that something is important and needs to be addressed, whatever the political cost. Do you have any thoughts on this? I'm sure you think about it every day, but
yeah, I have thoughts on it. Exactly. I kind of live and breathe thoughts on it, of course. So that was a phenomenal commission. The Simpson-Bowles Commission came out with a blueprint that was about $4 trillion in savings that would have brought our budget down to a point where the economy was growing faster than the debt. We could have handled it. It was really elegantly structured, where it had a little bit of something for everyone to hate. The bipartisan commitment to it was very high, with some of the most extremely progressive members of Congress to the most extremely conservative members of Congress agreeing to it. And the effort that those two patriots, I agree with you, put in to get them to yes had a lot of trust building, understanding each other's values, and really working through those policies in great, great detail. It's still the answer for today. Frankly, it would need to be bigger, because with the elapsed time, things are much worse than they were then. But that's still the right blueprint. And we used to refer to it as, let's go big. Let's fix the problem. Let's put this in place. And we would have been in such a stronger position today if we had done that. You had to wait till the economy was strong enough, because we were coming out of recession. You never want to put these policies in place too quickly, but they were the right policies. That said, we couldn't get it done because Congress was so broken then, and in many ways the political leadership didn't want to solve these problems. They almost like to have them out there to run attack ads, so-and-so's trying to raise your taxes, so-and-so's trying to steal your Social Security. It's all for political gain. But that environment is so much worse now. I'm really pessimistic about our ability to fix the situation. And so I think instead of going big, this is a moment where we should go incremental. And it's not as encouraging a bumper sticker, I will tell you that. But I think we have to take this in pieces. So Social Security is a program we all know, we all care about. We've seen its many successes. There is a constituency of people that really care about fixing Social Security. And it does need to be bipartisan, and it does need to be soon. So we can take that as one piece. Another piece would be, we passed the final deal to deal with COVID, which was the package that was too big and spent much more than we needed. And in the end, it's going to cause a lot of inflation, at least temporarily, it looks like. It was about $1.9 trillion. Could we put together a package that would offset the costs of that? Not the full $6 trillion in borrowing for COVID, but at least that 1.9. And the answer is yes, we could. And we could do it in a way that's actually politically tough, but doable. It would be those spending caps on discretionary spending, along with enforcing tax gap efforts, so we start to collect more of the revenue that the country's owed. And there's a couple $100 billion in healthcare reforms that both Republicans and Democrats agree on. We could build a package there that would save this amount of money. And I think for Congress to actually do something that's bipartisan and hard, in some ways they'd get their mojo back. They'd be like, look, we can actually govern instead of pandering to our voters. So I'd like to see them fix Social Security and try a small package. And then out of that, we'd see who the fiscal leaders are. We give a Fiscal Heroes Awards away every year to members of Congress who are really willing to focus on this issue and work on it. And it's hard to find heroes. We do actually have a lot of them right now. But it's hard to find them, and it's particularly hard to find leadership that lets them have a voice. But if they were to have one success, then I think you'd see more follow that. The final thing that's really great out there is called the Trust Act, which is a commission bill, which says if there's any if there's any trust fund that's headed towards insolvency, a special commission should be built to focus on coming up with fixes for that. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral. Mitt Romney and Joe Manchin, Gallagher, Case, Peters in that house. I mean, it's really a good group of people. Let's put this in place. It is nothing short of dangerously negligent that we know Social Security can't make good on its promises, and we're doing nothing to fix it. So the Trust Act would help with that and other trust funds. So those would be my three biggest recommendations. Or we could do another bill like Simpson Bowles. We could start all over again. Al Simpson and Erskine Bowles are both on my board. They say we draft them to come back and work on this all over again. Not really. I think they're exhausted because I've never seen two people work harder on an issue. But I do think that that method, and certainly building trust between members of Congress so they get to where they can make these hard choices, is what we're going to need. But I would point out in our last few minutes here, here's the point I'm going to make. Our country is dangerously polarized. We have gotten to the point where we think if somebody doesn't agree with us, they are downright evil. We no longer want to talk to them. We no longer want to listen to them, most importantly. And we no longer are entering these discussions with a sense of inquisitiveness, but rather a sense of certainty that is leaving us so isolated from people with different opinions and so unable to function that you hear more and more people saying, like, I don't want to live with them. I don't want to be in the same country with them, whichever the them is, it's on both sides. And if we don't address this polarization at a very moment when we have a massive foreign disinformation and cyber campaign going against our country that jeopardizes our strength and our well-being, if we don't address this internal polarization and do some of the hard things that governing entails, and one of those things is getting your books in order so that you're not so fiscally weak, I don't see how we survive this moment and come out on the other side looking like the country that we know. There are many things we have to do to improve our systems, both our political and our economic system. And we need really strong, compelling, brave leadership to do so. But if we don't fix ourselves, we're not going to be able to fix the debt. We're not going to be able to fix all these other issues. And we are not going to be strong enough against the very severe threats that are headed our way and that we're slowly waking up to. So it is not an optimistic note on which to leave us on, but it is a one of, we got to see how important this moment is. Doing the right thing isn't always doing the easy thing. And we have to switch our approach and start doing the right thing and taking with that the trade-offs, the hard choices, and the compromise that are inherent in governing a country as big and important as ours.
Well, on this note of both, how can I say, guarded, I would say guarded optimism. Maybe there is a chance that, as you say, wiser people will prevail and will bring us together through the action of your organization and others that are working along the same lines of yours. And hopefully we can make progress. As you indicated, we thank you very much for spending your time with us today and for shedding light on issues that, quite frankly, most of us cannot embrace because they appear to be too complicated and too extraneous from our daily lives, but in fact, they do affect the destiny of this nation. So on behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University, I thank you so much, Maya, for being with us, and hopefully we'll see you again, and good luck with your work.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me today. Take care.